Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in internet shitlords. And today you'll notice that I have up here, this is it's a special edition, but it's the original first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, which is an incredible RPG resource full of some really fantastic stuff. This is the 2014 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, which some of you will not be nearly as familiar with it as with the first edition one, but it too is filled with a very good amount of resources. Now, I'm not saying that it's as good as the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, or say something like the Rules Encyclopedia, but it does have a considerable amount of very good resources for DMs. It's probably, in my opinion, it's a better DMG than the third and certainly the fourth edition DMGs. Probably better than the second, for that matter. Though I guess that could be debated by some people, maybe. Though I think really, the ones that stand out above all else, hey, it's a meatball. The ones that stand out above all else are the first edition and the Rules Encyclopedia. Now this here is the Gonzo Fantasy Companion, which I've just got for the sake of product placement, because I gotta have something of mine there. The Gonzo Fantasy Companion, as it is, also has a whole bunch of really fantastic resources to make your fantasy setting, whichever one you choose it to be, filled with more unusual and weird things, some exciting, strange creatures and items. Speaking of strange creatures, and lots and lots of other goodies, so be sure to check it out. In any case, the reason I've got the Dungeon Master's Guide out today is because I'm going to be talking about the information of what we know the new Dungeon Master's Guide, the 2024 version, happens to have. And I had predicted, those of you who follow my my videos will remember that I had said back when I was talking about the new Player's Handbook, with all of its ridiculous art and things like that, that the worst suffering victim of the new books is going to be the Dungeon Master's Guide. I had predicted that it would happen because they were going to replace sections that were intended, in the 2014 version contained a whole bunch of actually useful DM resources. They'd replace it with nonsense and woke garbage. And it has come to pass. That is in fact the case. So that is why I am now focusing on this topic. So what we know, for example, from the previews that have come out, is that the new DMG is not so concerned with things about exciting adventure design, good random tables, or things like that. It's certainly not like the 5th edition DMG was. It doesn't have as many generators, but instead it replaces that with a bunch of safety tools. Safety tools, I think most of you know what that is, but just in case, if there's somebody relatively new that is, or somebody who's been playing only older games and has no idea what has become of the industry, is an idea that was promoted by progressive entryists into the hobby. It's the origin of safety tools comes out of the BDSM scene, and naturally, progressives, what do you want? They were probably taking it directly from these other aspects of their lives. And essentially, because if you're doing something like that, right, if you're involved in that scene, naturally you do want to have certain safety tools, right? Because there's a lot of potential for abuse and things like that, and for situations, of these sorts of weird, kinky things that they like to do getting out of hand. So there have to be very clear guidelines, and that makes perfect sense if you're talking about engaging in weird fetish stuff with other people. these guys looked at RPGs and said, well, we have to protect our fragile mental states when we're playing RPGs, and let's just port them over to there, right? So the new Dungeon Master's Guide, which obviously I don't have, but which is the one we're talking about, the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, or I don't know if it's well, yeah, I think it's coming out before 2025. But I'm not sure, because I think a lot of the ones that people have been talking about have been looking at previews of it. The new Dungeon Master's Guide, we know now for a fact, is going to contain an important section about these kind of tools. And one of them, for example, is this concept of lines and veils, which is that the DM has to carefully go over the sort of things he'll have in his campaign, and any player can jump in and say, no, hang on, this for me is a line, right? This thing that I don't like, you cannot do it, right? That's a line that cannot be crossed. And similarly, if someone is not as freaked out or whatever, emotionally traumatized by playing make-believe about elves, they might just say, no, well, this is a veil, so you can have it, but I don't want it explicitly described, you know. And you might think, well, what's the problem with that, right? Well, it's, you know, obviously, if a DM is starting a campaign, it makes sense that if the campaign is going to have something unusual for that type of RPG, right? Like, obviously, if you're running Call of Cthulhu, there's going to be horror stuff in it, right? So unless you're going to something like extremely grotesque or extremely risque, people should assume that there's going to be, you know, like tentacle monsters in a Cthulhu game, right? And if you have fantasy, there's going to be, you know, orcs and undead and things like that, right? So that can just be assumed, right? Unless you're dealing with someone who has no idea about D&D or about fantasy or something like that, but that would be a rarity. Now, of course, it's fine if a DM is planning on having some like controversial elements in it. He can feel free to tell the players about it, you know, at the start of the campaign, to explain kind of what are going to be the themes and what are going to be the potential encounters or elements of the game, to make sure that nobody's got a problem with it. Sure, I mean, that's fine, right? And then people can talk about it like adults. That's not what safety tools do, right? Because, of course, again, going back to, you know, BDSM, because you're dealing with stuff that can, for example, do bodily harm or terrifying emotional trauma, you have to be able, the person upon which this is being inflicted, let's say, has to be able to say a hard no, right? Or to force the either to permanently stop what's going on, or to force the person doing the inflicting to pause so that something can be negotiated, right? And then that's the principle that they're trying to push into RPGs. Now, part of this, of course, is because these people are deranged, but part of it is also a power play, right? One of the things that progressives hate is the idea of a dungeon master being the one that has the power. And I've also heard that in the new DMG, there are a lot of areas where, like in the earlier DMG, not to say nothing of like the far earlier ones, like the first edition DMG, that they talk about the DM deciding things, or the DM doing this or that, right? And in a lot of those areas, that's been switched around so that now it's the players that make the decision. So this is the idea of disempowering the DM in order to create, you know, it's the theory of the oppressed, right? All modern progressivism is based on the idea that if someone has more authority, that authority is illegitimate, and the person who has less authority is automatically being oppressed and needs to be re-empowered in a revolutionary way. You know, this is what they've done in education, this is what they've done in activism, and in pretty much every aspect of Western culture at this point. So their goal there really is for it to be that the DM isn't in charge of his campaign, the players are, right? The players get to decide what happens or what doesn't happen. and and the way it's set up is that this is then imposed on the DM. If the DM doesn't follow these rules, then they will be punished for it. Right? It is no longer acceptable for the DM to be in charge of the world. The big problem with this is that it absolutely shatters one of the fundamental states of RPG play, which is the creation of the sense of a living world, a virtual world. A world where a person, in our real world, a person can't just stop and say, hang on, I want to edit the world, right? I want to change these things that are happening because I don't like it, right? And if you can do that inside the setting, it destroys the feeling that setting is real. It destroys that virtual reality. So this is directly damaging the ability of the campaign to do what it needs to do, because only when you have a virtual world can you create a state of immersion in the players where their characters start to feel real, and they have that experience of a character taking a life of its own in a world that is symbolically at least alive, right? And in case lines and veils aren't enough, they also have implemented a slight variation of the X card. They couldn't provide cards, so what they've said is that if at any time a player needs the game to immediately stop so that they can force the DM to do something to change their mind, they will raise their hands in the form of an X, and then the DM must stop immediately, right? As this is an emergency sign. You can't do this, DM, right? And if it goes the way that the typical X card goes, and I have reason to believe it does because of something I'm about to tell you next, is that at that point the player has the option to explain what it is that they don't want to happen, or that the DM shouldn't be allowed to do, or to not give any explanation and simply demand that you go on to another scene, you skip forward in time, or that you stop play altogether, okay? And again, if the DM doesn't do this, he's probably a right-wing extremist and needs to be shunned or something like that, right? So these are idiotic techniques that destroy the very structure of RPGs and the function of RPG groups. Because if the DM doesn't have control, what happens in practice, as I've mentioned in other videos about safety tools, is that you get a dictatorship of the most immature, right? The dictatorship of the person who is the most at best, the person who is the most willing to have a psychotic break or something like that in the middle of a game, right? And at worst, what you have is people gaming the system, right? Because, for example, you can choose, your character's about to die, you can choose to raise the X, put your hands in the X like you're doing a weird version of the YMCA song or something, and say, no, I don't want my character to die, right? And that you're not allowed to do that because that's triggering, And so there are obviously, like, one of the major uses of these sort of safety tools is for people with bad intentions to game the system. Now, how do I know that this is likely to be what's there? Is because, ironically, Wizards of the Coast has gotten into some trouble because of these safety tools. Apparently, there are a large number of people complaining, I'm guessing mostly on Twitter X or Threads or wherever it is that leftists are going these days, that it depends on whether they have sworn to leave X forever or they've already come back to it after a few days, where they've been complaining that Wizards stole this, that they plagiarized it from the original authors, the original creator, so-called creator of the X card and the so-called creator of the lines and veils, and have not attributed it. And this is, I haven't actually read the book, right? But I'm guessing that what has happened is that what hasn't happened is that the D&D production team looked at, say, Ron Edwards' article online. I think it was Ron Edwards, somebody from The Forge anyways. The Forge's article on Lines and Veils, and cut and pasted and just put it as is into their new Dungeon Master's Guide. Or similarly, that they they stole the text of the person who first described the X card and put that into the Dungeon Master's Guide. That would be plagiarism. So, I mean, if that is actually what happened, then I guess these lunatics would be right. But my guess is that they've taken the ideas and they've rewritten it, you know, whoever it is, whatever typewriter monkey they have typing up the DM's guide, typed it in, right, in a new way. They didn't just copy paste it, right? They wrote it with the concept. And that concept, first of all, that's not copyrightable. And second, you know, it's not even original, as I pointed out, because these are concepts that were borrowed from an entire other, you know, cultural practice. So, you know, there's no real grounding for these people to be outraged, except that, you know, what they wanted was to, like, give credit to their culture heroes, right? To these people who have so bravely joined the hobby to try to destroy it, you know? So... yeah, that is the sort of trash you're going to get out of the Dungeon Master's Guide, and based on that alone, I mean, you already have to assume that means that at least portions of anything good that could have been in the Dungeon Master's Guide have been excised to make space for this nonsense. You can also assume that there's more stuff that has been taken out to put other stuff that is nonsensical, some of which will be woke, some of which won't exactly be woke, but will be much more useless than the stuff that was in the Dungeon Master's Guide. One example of this is that, you know, in some of the older D&D editions, there were rules about strongholds. There's some relatively brief rules about strongholds in the Dungeon Master's Guide. It actually, out of the various DM material in old edition D&D, it was fairly brief. But there's, for example, the Rule Cyclopedia dedicates a whole set of mechanics on how to run a domain in high-level play, you know. In the new Dungeon Master's Guide, they've done this thing which I think I mentioned before, and which was already mentioned before in the context of the VTT, which is Bastions, they call it, right? Which is like home bases for the player characters. Obviously, this is going to be part of like a, you know, virtual tabletop decorating app, you know, like something, a sub app or whatever you want to call it, a subroutine where you're going to be able to spend money to add cool stuff to your home base, right? And I thought that was already stupid enough, but apparently there's some new information in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is that basically inside of the Bastion, the DM has no power, right? They've made this explicit. So again, completely shattering any sense of verisimilitude. It's being treated as if it was, you know, like a safe spot in a video game, right? Because the DM is not allowed, without player consent, to do anything inside that Bastion, right? So you can't have the Bastion, for example, being under attack. Unless the player really wants it to be under attack for some dramatic reason, I suppose then they might be able to. But this is, you know, again, that completely shatters the emulation, the element of creating a living world. Because unless the player says so, he is completely safe. He's like home base when you're playing tag or something, right? They can't tag you there, right? They can't come after you. And so that not only breaks emulation, breaks the sense of a living world, but it also is fundamentally a dumber game, right? And it's a less interesting game because, like, what's at that point, what really is the point of having, you know, a stronghold or something like that? Like in traditional play, the idea of having a character end up having land or making a castle or a tower or you know, a hideout in the city or something like that, is that then they have another level of skin in the game, right? They want to try to maintain their resources, right? It's a resource playing game where you end up trying to work to improve and protect and expand your territory, so to say. And at the same time, you face potential, you know, sometimes potentially beneficial things that happen that assist you, and sometimes challenging things that put your efforts at risk.
And this is all going to be missing in the new 5th edition, in the 5.5 edition, in OneDnD, as it was originally meant to be called. Instead, it's just a place where you can, like, you know, put in decorations that you paid $1.99 for in the VTT program, you know. So it just makes it absolutely stupid and useless, you know. I'm sure we're going to be hearing more stuff coming out from the DMG, and I'm sure this isn't the last of it. I don't know if it's the worst of it, but maybe there will be other stuff that will be even worse than this, and if so, I will keep you updated. But already from this point, it's very clear that my prediction was absolutely right, that the worst of the 3 books is going to be the DM's Guide, because, you know, it's one thing that most of the people working at Wizards now have very, very little experience in even playing D&D, much less in game design or anything like that, or world design or any of that stuff. But, you know, it becomes especially difficult from that dungeon mastering point of view, right? Because that is a more complex thing to try to make resources for than, you know, just a player's handbook or something like that. So, you know, it creates another barrier of difficulty for these practically illiterate people who are designing the new DMG. I guess that's everything for today. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't subscribed, share this video anywhere you think people will find it interesting or where they'll get pissed off about it, and check out all of my products. The links are all in the description of this video, including the Gonzo Fantasy Companion, which is definitely, I mean, it's a very particular resource because it's for, like, weird fantasy gaming, but if you're into that, you're going to love it. And check out all my other products, including the Pundit Files, which are available only in the Red Room. The latest issue of the Pundit Files is more medieval authentic martial arts, which presents a number of new martial arts styles. It's a part 2 to Pundit Files number 3. This is, I think, Pundit Files 22, if I'm remembering correctly. Pundit Files 3 was the medieval renegade martial artist class and a half dozen or so martial arts styles that actually existed in the time of the Song Empire. And this is going to be, this is another half dozen or so martial arts styles that are also historically authentic from the period and somewhat more unusual and esoteric. So if you want more martial arts styles, if you're going to be running a game that has a martial artist class and want to give various options, you get even more in there. So be sure to check that out and check out all my other products. And I will keep reporting as more horrifying realities of the new Dungeon Master's Guide comes out. Currently smoking, I've just finished this Lorenzetti egg plus Argento roots.